Booyah! I'm about to get hormonal on your adrenal glands. This is the endocrine system, holes, anatomy, physiology, and we're talking hormones. Okay, what's the endocrine system besides making hormones? Well, second messenger system of the body. The hormone is the first messenger. The a variety of other things that we're going to show you temporarily are the second messengers, the stuff that act inside cells. We use these hormones called these chemical messengers, and they're released throughout the bloodstream. And they kind of regulate all these things, including reproduction, yes, making babies, growth, development, for example, growth hormone, mobilization of body defenses, so triggering your immune system to mature, maintenance of homeostasis, balance, and regulation of your metabolism, all the reactions that occur in your body to make you hot. All right, so hormones specifically are produced by specific cells. We call them glands, and they secrete them into extracellular fluids. And so there can be exocrine glands and endocrine glands. Mostly we'll be focusing on endocrine glands that produce these hormones. And then the blood is going to move the hormones around to their specific effectors, their target cells. And they can regulate the activity of other cells, of course. So there's different types of proteins. There's amino acid-based hormones, which for the most part we're not going to really refer to them as proteins or peptides or amines. We're just going to call them amino acid-based hormones or polar hormones, meaning they love water. They're hydrophilic. The other category being steroids, and these are based from cholesterol, which is why it's important that you have cholesterol in your diet and that your body makes it. You can't take too much cholesterol-lowering medication because too low of cholesterol is bad, just like too high of cholesterol. We use cholesterol to make steroid hormones like testosterone or estrogen, and they are non-polar hormones, or they don't like water. They're oily, if you want to think of it like that, fatty. The last one, which we won't talk much about, are prostaglandins, and these are also fatty, tied to pain response and that kind of stuff. So how do they work? So they only act on certain targets or cells, and they have to have a specific protein receptor. So if I here have a hormone, this hormone must fit specifically into a receptor, and then it triggers a series of reactions internally. The hormone itself is, again, the first messenger, and then the second messenger is various chemicals that occur that are released and fluctuate inside the cell. What can happen due to a hormone binding to the cell? This includes the membrane permeability or electrical charge of the membrane can change. You can produce or turn on the synthesis of proteins or enzymes inside. You can turn on enzymes themselves, not just the making of the enzyme or the protein, but turn on the switch that that enzyme is, or turn it off, inactivate it. And then you can also stimulate cell division, mitosis. Okay, so let's talk first about how steroid hormones work. Because they are fat-based, they love fat, they hate water, they can actually go through the plasma membrane because the majority of the plasma membrane is fatty. So they enter through the cell, they go through the cytoplasm, and they actually go into the nucleus, and they bind to a protein inside the nucleus that's going to alter the programming in the cell. So it's going to turn on or off DNA and genes to typically activate or produce new proteins, synthesize new proteins. So this is showing you what that looks like. Here the steroid hormone passes through, binds to an intracellular receptor here, which then turns on the DNA, this region of DNA, to make a protein that you see there. That's how steroid hormones work, fatty. Non-steroid or amino acid-based hormones, they have to bind to a receptor on the membrane. They can't go through because they're big and they're polar. They don't like fatty substances. And this is going to set off a series of reactions inside the cell with these second messengers, as I mentioned before, which then can cause a variety of different things, including making proteins, turning them off, turning them on, that type of thing. So here you see an amino acid-based or polar hormone, non-steroid, binds to a receptor, triggers a series of enzymatic reactions that uses a second messenger. Here we have cyclic AMP, or CAMP, as some people will call it, a second messenger. And in this case, what it's doing, is glycogen breakdown. Glycogen, again, is the long-chain glucose molecule found in the liver and the muscle cells. If this is actually glycogen breakdown, then this would be epinephrine, for example. When epinephrine binds to the receptors of the liver, it triggers the breakdown of glycogen, freeing up glucose into the bloodstream. Okay. So all these systems work, for the most part, through negative feedback, which means that there's a balanced set point, kind of like the thermostat in your house. And if it gets too hot, the thermostat, the AC turns on and cools it back down. If it gets too cold, the heat turns on and brings it back up to that ideal set point. Hormones work in the same way. There's an ideal set point of a variety of things, but of that hormone specifically. And if there's not enough of the hormone, the system will turn itself on. And if there's too much of the hormone, the system will turn itself off and bring the levels back down. So a stimulus or low hormone levels themselves in the blood triggers the release of more hormone. And then the hormone release stops when an appropriate level in the blood is reached. So there's a very specific ideal points in the blood that's necessary. And this is actually why it's such a big deal that so many of the chemicals in our environment are hormone mimics. They are shaped very similar to hormones, and because of that, they bind to your receptors and work like hormones, and so your body reacts as if there's excess hormone. Such as, for example, in plastic water bottles, there's a chemical called BPA. It's been outlawed in kids' plastics, but in generic plastic it exists. And if that BPA gets out into your water, BPA is an estrogen mimic, and that triggers estrogen levels in your body to rise. Not in reality, but it's perceived as if there's extra, and that can trigger a variety of things. For example, it can increase breast cancer, which is tied to estrogen levels. So here, let's talk specific glands. The granddaddy gland of all these is in the brain. It's the hypothalamus that we've talked about before, and it's connected directly through this stalk to the anterior pituitary and to the posterior pituitary. In this case, we'll talk about the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is going to secrete hormones that have activity directly on the thyroid gland, the adrenal cortex, and the gonads in this case. And these are going to secrete additional hormones, which we'll talk about later. This is just showing you how endocrine glands can stimulate release of other hormones from other endocrine glands. So, for example, here we have a capillary that contains a very low concentration of calcium. And this low concentration of calcium is going to stimulate the parathyroid glands, these teeny little white dots, which sit on the thyroid itself, and they're going to release a hormone called, of all things, parathyroid hormone. And as a result, that's going to raise calcium levels in the blood. It's going to cause calcium to be removed off of the bone and into the blood. Giving you an example here. This is called humoral stimuli of endocrine glands. Not a big deal that you know humoral in this case. There's also neural stimulus. So there's some cells that are neuronal, part of the nervous system, but they act hormonally. So they're connected by a nervous system connection, or a neuron, but that gland will then release a hormone. So instead of one hormone triggering another gland to release another hormone, we have one gland connected to, or one structure connected to a gland through a neuron or a nerve, and then that gland will release a hormone. Such as in this case, we see the adrenal medulla. The adrenal glands sit on top of your kidneys, and there's two parts, but specifically the inside, the adrenal medulla, releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, or if you like, adrenaline and noradrenaline. And these are important for really fast-acting fight or flight. And so there's a direct neuronal connection from the spinal cord, from the CNS, to the adrenal medulla, so that the release of those hormones is really fast. And you see under the control of the sympathetic nervous system in this case. So where are all these glands? Let's hit these. We have in the brain, okay, the pineal gland, which we've talked about before, the hypothalamus, and it's tied to the pituitary gland, specifically the anterior pituitary, but also the posterior pituitary gland. We have the thyroid gland in our neck, just below our cricoid cartilage here. Also, the parathyroid glands sit on it, on the posterior side of the thyroid gland, between your trachea and your thyroid. Then you have the thymus, which sits on top of the heart. And down here we have the adrenal glands and the pancreas, and then the ovaries or gonads, the ovaries or testes in this case. let's take a pause here to make sure I get this in and I'm not too long, and then we'll pick this up for part 2.